Her husband gave her to a mountain man as punishment for not bearing sons. That's what the town whispered after church, as she was handed off like livestock in front of God and everyone. They said the man who took her was half ghost, half savage, silent, scarred, and living where no roads go. She expected cold hands, maybe worse. But what she found was a fire lit, and eyes that didn't flinch when they saw her. And just when the snow began to fall, so did secrets, buried deep, tied to blood, land, and a name she never asked to carry. Now they all want what she's holding. But when the law turns its badge and the church turns its face, who'll ride with the woman they gave away? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The late summer sun cast long shadows across Hollow Rock's dusty main street as the congregation filed out of the weathered clapboard church. The white-painted building stood stark against the Montana sky, its bell tower reaching toward heaven like a pleading finger. Hannah Lou Braddock's heart quickened as her husband, Thaddeus, gripped her arm and steered her toward the gathered townspeople. "Brothers and sisters," Thaddeus's voice boomed across the churchyard. "The good book tells us that a wife's duty is to bear fruit." His fingers dug deeper into Hannah's flesh. "After 7 barren years, I can no longer abide this failure." Hannah's cheeks burned as whispers rippled through the crowd. Women who'd shared recipes and quilting circles now averted their eyes. The baker's wife clutched her own swollen belly protectively. "Therefore," Thaddeus continued, "I hereby dissolve my connection to Hannah Lou." He yanked her forward, making her stumble. "Fletcher, come claim what we discussed." From the shadows of the livery stable emerged Cade Fletcher, the mountain man they called Bear Man. His buckskins were worn but clean, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples. He moved with the quiet grace of a hunter, saying nothing as he led forward a sturdy pack mule loaded with prime furs. 3 dozen beaver pelts, Thaddeus announced, plus the mule and that fine Kentucky whiskey. He pulled a bottle from his coat with flourish. "Fair trade for damaged goods, wouldn't you say?" Hannah's legs trembled as Thaddeus shoved her toward Cade. The trapper's face remained impassive, but his eyes held something Hannah couldn't name. Not pity, not desire, but perhaps understanding. "Go on then," Thaddeus sneered. "You're his problem now." Cade's calloused hand steadied her elbow as she mounted the mule. He swung up behind her on his own horse, a rangy bay. Without a word, he clicked his tongue and turned their mounts toward the mountain trail. The whispers followed them out of town. Hannah kept her spine straight, though tears threatened. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The trail wound higher into the Bitterroots as afternoon stretched into evening. The mule's steady gait jostled Hannah's stays until each breath became torture. Her Sunday-best boots, meant for church floors, not mountain paths, pinched with every step. Cade spoke not a word, but occasionally his hand would steady her when the trail grew treacherous. As the sun sank behind the peaks, they crested a ridge to reveal a small cabin nestled in a protected hollow. Smoke curled from its stone chimney and a neat woodpile lined one wall. Hannah's new owner? Husband? What was she to call him? Dismounted first, then helped her down with surprising gentleness. Her legs nearly buckled as they touched earth. 7 hours in the saddle had left her muscles trembling. The cabin door creaked open to reveal a single room, neat but spare. A bed occupied one corner, its quilt patched but clean. A pot-bellied stove squatted in the center, and dried herbs hung from the rafters. Cade lit a brass lantern, its warm glow softening the shadows. He gestured to a pot of beans warming on the stove, then to the bed. When Hannah hesitated, he shook his head and pointed to himself, then to a bedroll near the hearth. The meaning was clear. The bed was hers alone. Hannah sank onto a rough-hewn chair, her corset stays digging into her ribs like accusing fingers. Cade spooned beans into a tin plate and set it before her with a chunk of cornbread. Then he turned his back, giving her privacy to eat. The food was simple but hot, the first she'd had since breakfast. As Hannah ate, she watched Cade spread his bedroll by the fire's warmth. His movements were efficient, practiced, a man used to solitude. Yet there was nothing threatening in his manner, nothing to suggest he viewed her as Thaddeus's trade goods. When she finished eating, Cade took her plate without comment. He added wood to the fire, checked the door's latch, then settled onto his bedroll. The lantern's flame painted shadows on the log walls as Hannah perched on the edge of the bed, still fully dressed. She waited for demands, for cruel words, for rough hands, but Cade simply pulled his blanket up and turned toward the fire, leaving her to find her own way in this strange new world. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that echoed Hannah's heart. Yet somehow, in this bare cabin with this silent man, she felt safer than she had in years beneath Thaddeus's fine roof. Hannah lay rigid in the unfamiliar bed, her body tense beneath the rough wool blanket. The cabin's darkness pressed around her, broken only by the dying embers in the hearth. Every creak of the settling logs made her flinch. She waited for heavy footsteps, for demanding hands, the treatment she'd known from Thaddeus when his moods turned dark. But the only sounds were the gentle pop of the fire and Cade's steady breathing from his place on the floor. He'd spread a woven mat near the hearth and wrapped himself in a thick buffalo robe, keeping a respectful distance that seemed as natural to him as breathing. The night hours crept by. Hannah dozed fitfully, her dreams filled with the sneering faces of townspeople and Thaddeus's cruel voice announcing her worth in pelts and whiskey. When she finally drifted into true sleep, it was with her arms wrapped tight around herself as if holding her scattered pieces together. Morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, rousing her. Hannah blinked, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar ceiling beams. A tin cup steamed on the small table beside the bed, dark coffee sending tendrils of warmth into the cool air. Next to it sat a bowl of beans, simply prepared but hot. The cabin was empty. Through the window she could see Cade in the yard, his powerful shoulders rising and falling as he swung an axe. The steady thunk of steel against wood echoed across the small clearing. Hannah's feet screamed in protest as she eased them to the floor. Her fine leather boots had not been made for mountain trails, and yesterday's long ride had left them raw with blisters. She limped to the door, holding onto the rough-hewn furniture for support. The morning air bit sharp and clean as she stepped outside. Frost sparkled on the woodpile, and her breath came in visible puffs. Cade paused in his work, setting the axe aside as he noticed her pained movement. Without a word, he went to the cabin's small lean-to storage. He returned with a pair of soft leather moccasins, well-worn but sturdy. Beside them, he placed a small clay pot that smelled of herbs and pine sap. "For your feet," he said, his voice rough from disuse. They were the first words he'd spoken since bringing her here. Hannah sank onto a stump and carefully removed her ruined boots. Her stockings were spotted with blood where the leather had rubbed raw. The salve from the clay pot was cool and soothing, bringing immediate relief to the angry blisters. The moccasins fit loosely but comfortably over her bandaged feet. The day unfolded slowly, marked by simple tasks. Though the air held autumn's chill, the sun warmed her face as she explored the small yard. Cade worked steadily, chopping wood, checking his tools, mending a broken fence post. He moved with purpose but without hurry, as if time held a different meaning up here in the mountains. His quiet presence was so different from Thaddeus's controlling demands that Hannah found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. His face was weathered but not unkind, and his movements held a grace that belied his size. As evening approached, Hannah gathered her courage. "Why did you accept me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In trade, I mean." Cade looked up from the wood he was stacking. His dark eyes held hers steadily. "Didn't trade for a servant," he said simply, then returned to his work. Those 4 words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Hannah felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, like a knot slowly coming undone. When darkness fell, Hannah found herself helping prepare a simple stew of dried meat and root vegetables. The familiar task of cooking settled her nerves, and the cabin filled with warm, homey smells. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly in the background. After the dishes were cleaned, Cade settled by the lamp to mend his traps. Hannah watched his large hands move with surprising delicacy as he worked the metal mechanisms. The lamplight carved deep shadows in his face, highlighting lines of old grief around his eyes and mouth. She recognized that look. It was the same one she saw in her own mirror, the mark of wounds that went soul deep. As she watched him work, Hannah realized something profound. In all his silence, in all his simple actions, Cade had shown her more real dignity than she'd ever found in Thaddeus's fancy sermons or grand pronouncements. Here, in this rough cabin with this quiet man, she wasn't property to be traded or a failure to be punished. She was simply a person, allowed to exist without demands or conditions. The days flowed together like the mountain streams, each one bringing a gentle rhythm to Hannah's new life. Snow began to dust the peaks, first as delicate flurries, then in earnest. The morning air grew sharp enough to steal her breath when she stepped outside to gather wood. Cade prepared for the changing season, checking his traps and hunting closer to the cabin as the weather turned. Before each departure, he left her supplies laid out with careful thought: flint and steel for the fire, matches wrapped in oilcloth, and rough notes scratched onto scraps of paper. His handwriting was awkward but clear, warning her about wind through the chimney or how to bank the coals. During his absences, Hannah found purpose in small tasks. She swept the packed earth floor, organized his scattered tools, and aired out musty furs. The cabin slowly transformed under her touch, not into something fine, but into something that felt more like home. One morning, while storing a fresh sack of flour in the root cellar, her hand brushed against a wooden box pushed far back on a shelf. Dust coated its surface, speaking of years untouched. She hesitated, knowing she shouldn't pry, but something about its careful placement drew her attention. Inside, wrapped in soft deerskin, lay 3 treasures: a leather-bound ledger decorated with Comanche symbols, a tiny beaded moccasin sized for a child's foot, and a necklace of silver and turquoise that caught the dim light. Hannah's fingers hovered over them, recognizing these weren't just possessions but pieces of someone's heart. That evening, as darkness settled thick around the cabin, she heard Cade's voice carrying softly through the wall. She paused in her mending, listening. The words were foreign, Comanche prayer flowing like water over stones. His voice held a gentleness she'd never heard before, filled with reverence and old pain. Hannah bowed her head, letting him have this private moment. She thought of the treasures in the box, understanding now they were more than simple keepsakes. They were memories, precious and sharp as broken glass. When Cade returned from hunting the next day, his boots heavy with snow, he saw immediately that something had shifted. Perhaps it was the way she glanced at the root cellar door, or how her eyes held questions she was too kind to ask. He set his rifle aside and stood quiet for a long moment, snow melting from his coat. "My wife made that," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "Our boy wore that." 5 simple words that carried the weight of mountains. Hannah nodded, her throat tight with understanding. She didn't press him for more. His voice had held enough pain to fill all the valleys between here and town. Instead, she served him cornbread and rabbit stew, letting comfortable silence fill the space between them. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains, blanketing the world in white. The wind moaned through the pines, but inside the cabin, the fire crackled warm and steady. Hannah watched the flames dance, thinking about the items in the box. She thought about the townspeople who whispered about Cade, calling him that savage when they thought no one could hear. But she saw something different now. She saw a man who had loved deeply enough to learn his wife's prayers, who had kept his son's tiny moccasin like it was made of gold. She saw someone who had lost everything but still found the grace to show kindness to a stranger. The howling wind rattled the window, but Hannah felt no fear. For the first time since being traded away like unwanted goods, she felt truly warm. Not just from the fire, but from something deeper. The warmth that comes from understanding, from seeing truth instead of rumors, from finding humanity in unexpected places. Cade added another log to the fire, its light catching the silver threads in his dark hair. His movements were careful, deliberate, like a man who had learned to carry his grief with dignity. Hannah picked up her mending again, letting the quiet settle around them like the snow outside, soft and clean and new. The storm howled through the mountains like a living thing, piling snow in drifts taller than a man. The narrow trail that connected Cade's cabin to the world below disappeared entirely, swallowed by white. Days stretched into weeks as winter settled hard around them. Their food stores began to shrink. Hannah watched with growing concern as the flour sack grew lighter, the dried beans fewer. But Cade remained steady, showing no trace of worry. Instead, he began to teach her. "Here," he said one morning, hanging strips of fresh venison in the smokehouse. "Watch close." His rough hands moved with practiced grace as he demonstrated how to cut the meat just so, how to position it over the smoldering fire. "Too much heat cooks it, too little won't cure it. Listen to the sound of the smoke." Hannah learned to read the different colors of wood smoke, to feel the right texture of meat as it dried. Her hands grew confident with the knife, no longer hesitating over each cut. The work was methodical, almost peaceful. In the evenings, Cade taught her to render tallow from deer fat, the process filling the cabin with a rich, warm smell. "Good for candles," he explained, stirring the pot carefully. "For soap, too. Nothing goes to waste up here." They fell into an easy rhythm. Hannah kept the cabin, tended the fire, and learned Cade's ways of survival. He hunted, trapped, and showed her the skills that had kept him alive in these mountains. They spoke little, but the silence between them grew comfortable, like a well-worn blanket. Then one afternoon, the quiet was broken by an unexpected sound, the crunch of horse hooves in snow. Cade reached for his rifle, but relaxed when he recognized the figure fighting through the drifts. "Postal rider," he said, opening the door, "from the agency." The rider, ice crusted in his beard, handed over a single envelope before hurrying back down the trail. The letter was addressed to Hannah, the paper wrinkled and stained from its long journey. The postmark showed it was 3 weeks old. "From Pastor Tolliver," Cade said, studying the return address. He held the letter out to Hannah, but her hands trembled too much to take it. "Would you?" she whispered. "Would you read it?" Cade nodded, breaking the seal. His voice, usually so quiet, filled the cabin as he read, "Dear Mrs. Braddock, I write with grave news. Your husband, Thaddeus Braddock, is dead. He was shot during a drunken dispute with one of his ranch hands 2 nights ago. The matter is being investigated, but witnesses say he drew first. I must inform you that his will, filed with the territorial court, leaves all property and holdings to his rightful wife or her designee. As no formal divorce was ever registered, you remain, in the eyes of the law, his widow and sole heir to the Braddock estate. Please exercise caution. There are those who would contest this inheritance. God keep you safe, Pastor Elias Tolliver." The letter crackled as Cade lowered it. Hannah sat very still, her face pale as the snow outside. The implications of the news settled over them like frost. "Then folk will come for you," Cade said simply. His words carried no judgment, just the weight of truth. Hannah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the fire. The Braddock estate was vast, thousands of acres, hundreds of head of cattle, contracts with the army for beef. Men had killed for far less in these territories. The wind moaned around the cabin corners and Hannah shivered. She looked at Cade, seeing the concern in his dark eyes. He didn't need to say more. They both knew that their quiet routine, the peace they'd found in this mountain sanctuary, was about to end. The letter lay on the table between them, innocent as a snake in the grass. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but now every gust of wind, every creak of timber, carried a new tension. Somewhere below, in the valleys they'd left behind, wheels were already turning, plans being made. The mountains had kept them safe, hidden away from the world's complications, but paper and ink had found them anyway, bringing trouble on winter winds. Night settled deep over the mountain cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Hannah sat cross-legged before the flames, turning the turquoise necklace over and over in her fingers. The firelight caught the smooth stones, making them glow like captured pieces of sky. Cade sat in his usual spot, a respectful distance away, whittling a piece of pine. The soft scrape of his knife against wood filled the silence between them. Hannah traced the intricate beadwork, marveling at the careful craftsmanship. "She made it herself," Cade said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. learned from her grandmother, said every bead was a prayer. Hannah looked up, surprised by this voluntary sharing. Cade's face was half hidden in shadow, but she could see the old pain etched there. "What happened to them?" she asked softly, though part of her feared the answer. Cade's knife stilled. He stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. "Federal marshals came to our village, said they were looking for horse thieves." His voice grew rough. Thaddeus and his men rode with them. Volunteers, they called themselves. Hannah's heart clenched. "My husband helped do that?" Cade nodded once, a sharp movement. "There were no horse thieves, just women, children, old ones." He set down his knife, his hands trembling slightly. "My wife, our boy, they didn't spare anyone." The necklace felt heavy in Hannah's hands. She thought of Thaddeus, how he'd preached about righteousness every Sunday, how he'd quoted scripture while dealing out cruelty. "I didn't know," she whispered. After ... Cade continued, "I couldn't wear the uniform anymore, couldn't serve men who'd murder innocents. So I left, came to these mountains." He picked up his knife again, but didn't resume whittling. "Been here since." Hannah watched the flames, sick with the knowledge of what Thaddeus had done. The man who'd cast her aside for barrenness had helped destroy a family, a community. The pieces of her past were shifting, revealing ugly truths beneath. They sat in silence until the fire burned low. When Hannah finally spoke, her voice was firm. "I need to go to town." Cade looked up sharply. "Snow's coming." "Before it does, then." She met his gaze steadily. "That letter changes everything. I need to know what's happening." "Deputy Reed Harlan," Cade said, the name carrying a warning. "He'll be watching for you." Hannah remembered the young deputy, how he'd courted her before Thaddeus. His charm had always seemed too polished, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "He was sweet on me once," she acknowledged. "More than that." Cade stood, moving to add wood to the fire. "He's ambitious. Your name on that will is like gold in his hands, a door to power." "All the more reason to go," Hannah insisted. "I won't hide while others decide my fate." Cade studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll need supplies, warm clothes. The trail's treacherous this time of year." "We?" Hannah asked, surprised. "Can't let you face them alone." He began listing what they'd need, his voice practical now. "Blankets, food that'll keep. Might have to shelter in caves if the weather turns." Hannah clutched the necklace, its weight a reminder of all that had been lost, all that might still be lost. But she couldn't hide in these mountains forever, no matter how safe they felt. The truth of Thaddeus's crimes, the inheritance he'd left behind, these were burdens she had to face. They spent the rest of the evening preparing, gathering supplies, checking equipment. Cade showed her how to pack for mountain travel, how to distribute weight evenly in saddlebags. His instructions were clear, patient, born of years of survival in these harsh lands. The fire burned down to embers as they worked, and outside the wind picked up, carrying the promise of snow. Time was short. Soon the passes would be blocked, the town cut off until spring. Whatever they meant to do, it had to be done quickly. Hannah carefully wrapped the turquoise necklace and returned it to its box. The simple act felt like a promise, to honor the truth, to seek justice, to remember those who had been silenced. Tomorrow they would begin their journey down the mountain toward whatever waited in the valley below. The journey down from Cade's mountain cabin took 2 long days. Hannah's mule picked its way carefully along the steep trail while Cade led their small wagon loaded with supplies. The November wind cut sharp, carrying the bite of coming winter. They spoke little, saving their breath for the hard travel, but Hannah found comfort in Cade's steady presence ahead of her on the path. As they approached Hollow Rock, the first wisps of chimney smoke appeared against the gray sky. Hannah pulled her shawl tighter, steeling herself. The clip-clop of hooves on the packed dirt main street drew faces to windows and brought folks out onto porches. Whispers followed them like leaves in the wind. "Widow Braddock's back. With that mountain man, oh, bold as brass, ain't they?" Hannah kept her spine straight, though her hands trembled on the reins. She'd forgotten how it felt to be watched, judged, measured by every eye. The wooden cross of the little church came into view, and with it, a familiar figure in a black coat. Pastor Tolliver hurried down the chapel steps, his aged face creased with genuine concern. "Mrs. Braddock, thank the Lord you've arrived safely." He helped her down from the mule, his grip gentle but sure. "We've been most worried." "Much obliged, Pastor," Hannah said softly, finding comfort in his fatherly presence. But before she could say more, boot heels clicked on the wooden sidewalk. Deputy Reed Harlan approached, his badge catching the weak sunlight. His smile was wide, too wide, like a wolf trying to look friendly. "Well now, if it ain't our Hannah Lou, come back to claim what's rightfully hers." His eyes slid past her to Cade and his smile thinned. "Though some might question the company she's keeping." Cade said nothing, continuing to secure the wagon and animals. His silence seemed to irritate Harlan all the more. "Now, Hannah," the deputy continued, his voice thick as honey but twice as sticky, "I've arranged proper lodging for you with the widow Parker. No need for you to stay anywhere. Unsuitable." He shot another pointed look at Cade. Hannah felt her chin lift. "That's kind, deputy, but I'll be staying in the chapel's back room." She glanced at Pastor Tolliver, who nodded his approval. "And Cade stays with me." Harlan's face darkened for just a moment before his smile returned. "Now, Hannah, think of your reputation. What would dear Thaddeus say?" "I reckon he's said quite enough already," Hannah replied quietly but firmly. She turned to help Cade unload their supplies, making it clear the discussion was over. Pastor Tolliver helped them settle into the chapel's modest back room, which held 2 narrow cots and a small stove. As evening fell, Hannah lit the lamp and began arranging their few belongings. Cade stepped out to tend to the animals, moving like a shadow in the gathering dark. The thin walls of the chapel carried sounds clearly. Hannah was about to bank the stove when voices drifted in from the side of the building, Harlan's familiar drawl and another man's deeper tones. She moved closer to listen. "The land's too valuable to leave in a widow's hands, Ellis," Harlan was saying. 3,000 acres of prime grazing, water rights to boot. The syndicate needs that land." "Then make her an offer," the other man, Ellis, replied. "Every widow has her price." Harlan chuckled, the sound raising the hair on Hannah's neck. "Oh, she'll sell. Once she understands how dangerous it is for a lone woman to hold that much property. Accidents happen after all." Hannah's hand went to the beaded moccasin she kept hidden under her cloak, its presence a reminder of other lives destroyed by men's greed. The stakes were suddenly clear. This wasn't just about her inheritance. It was about power, about who controlled the land and the lives that depended on it. She thought of Cade's lost family, of Thaddeus's role in that tragedy, of all the quiet violence that had shaped this territory. The syndicate men might wear suits instead of war paint, but their hunger for land was just as fierce, their methods just as brutal. When Cade returned, he found her sitting by the stove, her face set in determined lines. "They mean to take it all," she whispered, "just like they took your people's land." Cade nodded once, understanding in his dark eyes. He added wood to the stove, and they sat in silence as night settled over Hollow Rock, each lost in thought about the battle that lay ahead. Morning light filtered through the dusty windows of the county clerk's office, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Hannah smoothed her skirts nervously as she and Cade waited for Mr. Peterson, the elderly clerk, to fetch the necessary paperwork. The office smelled of ink and old leather bindings, with rows of land records stretching toward the ceiling. "Here we are," Mr. Peterson wheezed, setting down a stack of documents. His wire-rimmed spectacles caught the light as he squinted at the papers. "The last will and testament of Thaddeus Braddock, may he rest in peace." He cleared his throat. "Everything appears to be in order for the transfer of ownership to you, Mrs. Braddock, as his legal widow." Hannah dipped the pen in ink, her hand steady despite the weight of the moment. Just as she was about to sign, Cade stepped forward, drawing something from his coat, an old leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse, "there's something you need to see first." Mr. Peterson blinked in surprise. It was perhaps the most words he'd ever heard from the mountain man. Cade carefully opened the ledger, revealing carefully drawn maps and neat columns of text in both English and Comanche. From a pocket, he produced a small carved stone marker, weathered but still showing clear tribal symbols. "This is a treaty marker," Cade explained, setting it gently on the desk. "And these papers show the original boundaries of Comanche territory. The northern section of the Braddock Ranch, nearly 1,000 acres, was seized illegally during the raids of 1867. Hannah's breath caught. She knew what those raids had cost Cade, knew the price his family had paid. Mr. Peterson adjusted his spectacles, peering at the documents with growing concern. "These appear authentic," the clerk muttered, running his finger along the neat rows of surveyor's marks. "But I don't see how—" "I want to split the property," Hannah interrupted firmly. "The stolen portion should be returned to its rightful owners, the surviving members of the Comanche family, if they can be found." A sharp intake of breath from the doorway made them all turn. Deputy Harlan stood there, his face darkening like a thundercloud. "Now see here," he began, stepping into the office. "You can't just give away valuable ranch land based on some old Indian papers." "These aren't just papers," Cade said quietly. "This is truth." Hannah straightened her spine. "I have the legal right to dispose of my property as I see fit, Deputy Harlan, and I choose to right an old wrong." Mr. Peterson cleared his throat nervously, glancing between them. "Well, yes, technically Mrs. Braddock has that right, but such a transfer would require extensive documentation, proof of tribal lineage, approval from the Indian agent." He shuffled through some papers. "It could take weeks, maybe months to process." "Then we'll wait," Hannah said firmly. She turned to face Harlan, whose hand had drifted to rest on his gun belt. "And in the meantime, I'll be staying right here in Hollow Rock to ensure everything is handled properly." Harlan's eyes narrowed to slits. "You're making a mistake, Hannah Lou. Some folks might take offense at you trying to give good Christian land back to its rightful owners," Cade cut in, his voice low but carrying an edge of steel. The two men locked eyes across the office, tension crackling between them. Mr. Peterson hurriedly began filling out forms, his pen scratching in the sudden silence. "I'll need to make copies of these documents," he said, gesturing to Cade's ledger, "and send inquiries to the territorial office about the proper procedures." Hannah nodded, watching as the clerk carefully copied the old boundaries and treaty marks. Each scratch of his pen felt like a step toward justice, toward healing something broken long ago. She glanced at Cade and saw in his face a complex mix of emotions: grief, hope, and something that might have been pride. "I'll file these today," Mr. Peterson said finally, sanding the ink dry. "But as I said, it will take time to process everything properly." "Time we got," Cade said simply, gathering up his ledger and the treaty marker with reverent hands. They left the office together, stepping out into the bright morning light. Behind them, Harlan's boots clicked on the wooden sidewalk as he stalked away, no doubt to report this development to his friends at the cattle syndicate. Hannah knew they'd just set something big in motion, something that would either bring justice or danger, or perhaps both. But watching Cade carefully tuck away the records of his people's loss and their hope for restoration, she knew they'd done right. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear as Hannah and Cade set out for the Indian Agency. Their mules picked their way carefully along the narrow trail, hooves crunching on frost-covered leaves. The leather satchel containing the transfer papers was secured firmly to Hannah's saddle, each step bringing them closer to making things right. Mill Creek lay ahead, its waters running low in the late season. The crossing would be easy, just a shallow ford between weathered banks. Cade rode slightly ahead, his injured shoulder still favoring the side where Hannah's crude stitches held the wound from their journey to town. The first shot cracked through the morning stillness like thunder. Cade's mule reared, nearly unseating him as he clutched his shoulder. Blood bloomed dark against his buckskin jacket. "Get down!" he shouted to Hannah, but it was too late. Men emerged from the brush on both sides of the creek, rifles raised. Deputy Harlan stepped out from behind a cottonwood tree, his badge catching the morning light. "Cade Fletcher," he called out, voice carrying across the water. You're under arrest for desertion from the United States Cavalry and outstanding charges of theft and murder." Hannah's heart hammered in her chest as more men appeared, ranch hands she recognized from the cattle syndicate's payroll. They had them surrounded. "These charges are false," she cried out, but Harlan was already moving forward, his gun trained steady on Cade. "Ma'am, we're here to protect you from this dangerous man," Harlan said, his tone dripping with false concern. "He's wanted in 3 territories. Been hiding up in those mountains, preying on honest folk." Cade remained still on his mule, blood seeping between his fingers where he gripped his shoulder. His eyes met Hannah's, dark with pain and warning. "Don't fight," they seemed to say. "Not yet." "Get down, Fletcher," Harlan ordered. Nice and slow. Cade complied, sliding carefully from his saddle. 2 men rushed forward to grab his arms, making him grunt in pain as they wrenched them behind his back. Hannah watched helplessly as they bound his wrists with rope. "The papers," Harlan said, turning to Hannah. "Hand them over." "I will not," she replied, lifting her chin. "Those documents are legal property being delivered to the Indian agent." Harlan nodded to one of his men, who roughly pulled Hannah from her mule. Another grabbed the satchel, tearing it free from her saddle. "This is for your own protection, Mrs. Braddock," Harlan said, taking the papers. "You've been under the influence of this savage deserter, making poor decisions about your property. We're taking you back to town where you'll be safe while we sort this out." "You have no right." Hannah struggled as 2 men took her arms, but their grip was iron strong. "I have every right," Harlan replied smoothly. "As deputy, it's my duty to protect a widow from being taken advantage of. Fletcher here has been filling your head with lies about land claims, trying to steal your property through false documents." Cade stood silent, blood still seeping from his wound, watching with eyes that burned with controlled fury. Hannah knew he wouldn't risk her safety by fighting back. Not now, not like this. They were separated. Cade was thrown roughly into a wagon, his hands still bound, while Hannah was forced onto her mule. The ride back to Hollow Rock was tense and silent, with armed men flanking them the whole way. In town, they dragged Cade toward the jail while Harlan personally escorted Hannah to the schoolhouse. The small building sat empty, the children's lessons canceled for this impromptu prison. "You'll stay here until we get this sorted," Harlan said, pushing her inside. "For your own good, of course. Can't have you running off and making more trouble." "The Indian agent will be expecting those papers," Hannah said, her voice steady despite her fear. "When they don't arrive, oh, I wouldn't worry about that." Harlan smiled coldly. "I'll make sure everything gets handled properly. You just rest here and let me take care of things." The door closed with a heavy thud, and Hannah heard the key turn in the lock. Through the schoolhouse window, she watched as 2 armed men took up positions outside. The autumn sun cast their shadows long across the yard. Guards, not protectors, no matter what Harlan claimed. She sank into one of the small student desks, her mind racing. Somewhere across town, Cade sat in a cell, wounded and alone. Their careful plans for justice lay in ruins, the transfer papers now in the hands of the very men who meant to stop them. But as Hannah sat in the failing light of the schoolhouse, she refused to give up hope. They had truth on their side, and sometimes truth was stronger than any gun. The schoolhouse grew cold as evening approached. Hannah huddled in her shawl, watching shadows lengthen across the wooden floor. The guard outside struck a match, the brief flare illuminating his bored face through the window. A soft knock at the back door made her start. "Child," Pastor Tolliver's gentle voice whispered through the crack. "Are you decent?" "Yes, Pastor," Hannah answered quietly, moving toward the sound. The door opened just enough for the elderly preacher to slip inside. He carried a covered basket, and his kind face was creased with worry. "I've brought you some bread and soup," he said, setting the basket on a desk, "and something else you might need." From his coat pocket, he withdrew a heavy iron key. "This opens the storage cabinet in the back," he explained in a hushed tone. "There's a window behind it that leads to the alley. What these men are doing, it isn't right. The Lord commands us to seek justice, not aid those who twist it." Hannah's fingers closed around the cold metal. "Thank you," she whispered. "But Cade?" "They've got him in the jail infirmary," Pastor Tolliver said. "The wound's infected. He's running a fever." He pressed a small bottle into her hand. "Laudanum. For his pain, if you can reach him." After the pastor left, Hannah waited until full dark. The guard's boots scraped against the boardwalk as he paced, then settled into the creaking chair they'd set out. Soon his breathing grew heavy with sleep. The storage cabinet's hinges protested softly as she pushed it aside. The window behind it was small, but she managed to squeeze through, dropping quietly into the narrow alley. Staying in the shadows, Hannah made her way to the jail. A single lamp burned in the infirmary window. She crept closer, peering inside. Cade lay on a narrow cot, his wrists secured with leather straps. Even in the dim light, she could see the sheen of sweat on his face. His shoulder was badly swollen where crude bandages wrapped the gunshot wound. The night deputy's snores drifted from the front office. Hannah eased the window open and slipped inside. "Cade," she whispered, touching his face. His skin burned with fever. His eyes fluttered open, glazed but focusing on her face. "Hannah!" His voice was rough. "You shouldn't be here." "Hush." She uncorked the laudanum bottle, helping him take a few drops. Then she pressed her lips to his hand where it lay bound. "I will fix this," she promised. "Rest now. Get stronger." She waited until his breathing evened out before slipping away into the night. The moon was high by the time she reached the Braddock Ranch. The house stood dark and empty. The servants had all been dismissed after Thaddeus's death. Hannah hitched the wagon she'd borrowed from behind the church and entered through the kitchen door. Memories assaulted her as she moved through the silent rooms. Here was where Thaddeus had first struck her. There was where she'd spent countless nights crying alone. But she wasn't that woman anymore. Thaddeus's study remained exactly as he'd left it, heavy with the smell of tobacco and leather. Hannah lit a lamp, its glow revealing the familiar space. The massive oak desk, the wall of leather-bound books, the Persian carpet he'd been so proud of. She began her search methodically, going through every drawer and cabinet. Nothing. But then she remembered how Thaddeus would sometimes pace in one spot while reading his correspondence. Always the same floorboard creaking under his weight. Getting on her hands and knees, Hannah examined the floor carefully. There, a board that didn't quite match the others. Using a letter opener from the desk, she worked it loose. The space beneath held a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. Hannah's hands trembled as she opened it. The writing inside was unmistakably Thaddeus's, the same precise hand that had signed their marriage certificate. As she read, her breath caught. Here was everything. Detailed accounts of illegal land seizures, payoffs to corrupt officials, and most damning of all, a full confession of the raid on Cade's village. Thaddeus had written it all down, perhaps as some form of private penance. The names, dates, and locations formed a perfect record of his crimes, including the murder of Cade's family. Hannah clutched the journal to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Here was the truth that could save Cade and restore justice. Here was the key to their freedom. Dawn was breaking as she carefully wrapped the journal and tucked it into her skirts. The eastern sky burned pink and gold, promising a new day. Whatever came next, she was ready. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold over Hollow Rock. The church bell rang across the frosty valley, calling the faithful to worship. Hannah stood in the shadow of the oak tree, watching townspeople file into the white clapboard building. Her black mourning dress rustled in the bitter wind, the journal heavy in her pocket. Inside, the familiar sense of wood polish and lamp oil filled the air. Hannah slipped into a back pew, keeping her head down as Pastor Tolliver began the service. The congregation's voices rose in hymn, but she remained silent, her fingers tracing the leather binding of Thaddeus's journal. Pastor Tolliver had just opened his Bible when Hannah rose. Her boots echoed on the wooden floor as she walked to the front. Whispers rippled through the pews. Mrs. Ellis clutched her pearls. Deputy Harlan's hand moved to his gun belt. "Forgive me, Pastor," Hannah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "But there's truth that needs speaking in God's house today." Pastor Tolliver studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The Lord's house should always welcome truth, child. Hannah turned to face the congregation. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating familiar faces. Faces that had watched her humiliation in the churchyard months ago. Faces that had turned away when she needed help. "My husband, Thaddeus Braddock, kept a private journal," she began, opening to the first marked page. In it, he confessed his sins, not to God but to himself. I will read his own words now. Her voice grew stronger as she read. May 15th, 1872. Today we drove the Comanche from Miller's Creek. The land was too valuable to leave in savage hands. Marshall gave us permission to use force, shot 3 braves who resisted. A woman and child died in the chaos. Fletcher saw it happen. Might be trouble there. But the deed is done. Land will be divided between our syndicate once the papers are fixed. Me's gasps echoed through the church. Hannah turned a page. August 1st, 1872. Paid Judge Wilson $200 to backdate the land grants. Ellis handled the paperwork. Harlan's uncle at the land office made it official. God forgive me, but a man must build his legacy however he can. Deputy Harlan stood, his face red. This is slander. You can't... Let her finish, Pastor Tolliver said firmly. Every soul here deserves to hear the full truth. Hannah continued reading, naming every man involved in the land theft, every bribe paid, every false document filed. She read Thaddeus's detailed account of the raid that killed Cade's family, how they'd murdered innocent people for land that wasn't theirs to take. And here, she said finally, is his last entry written 3 days before he died. The guilt weighs heavy. Fletcher's wife was with child when we killed her. The boy couldn't have been more than 4 years old. I see their faces in my dreams. My barren wife is God's punishment for my sins. Perhaps that's why I gave her to Fletcher, some twisted attempt at redemption. But there can be no redemption without confession. Silence fell over the church. Hannah closed the journal and looked at her neighbors. Cade Fletcher is no criminal. He's a man whose family was murdered for greed. The real criminals have been sitting in these pews counting blood money and calling it God's blessing. These are lies, Harlan shouted, drawing his pistol. But before he could raise it, Pastor Tolliver stepped between them. The only lies here, the old preacher said calmly, are the ones that let evil men prosper while good men suffer. Deputy Harlan, I suggest you lower that weapon in God's house. Other men stood, honest ranchers and farmers whose lands had never been stolen. They moved toward Harlan, their faces grim. The deputy's hand shook. Then he turned and fled, boots pounding down the church steps. Hannah watched him go, her heart pounding but her voice steady. I've sent copies of this journal to the territorial governor and the federal marshal's office. The truth can't be buried anymore. Murmurs filled the church as people began to realize the full implications. The syndicate's power was built on lies and murder. Harlan's flight was as good as a confession. Mrs. Braddock speaks truth, Pastor Tolliver announced. I've read the journal myself and verified the dates and documents mentioned. Cade Fletcher's name is cleared, and now we as a community must make this right. The morning sun streamed through the windows, touching each face in the congregation. Some wore shame, others shock, but in many, Hannah saw the dawning of understanding and the desire for redemption. The truth had been spoken in God's house. There was no turning back now. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as Hannah stood before the agency office, her black dress replaced by a simple blue calico. Around her, a small crowd had gathered. Townsfolk, tribal elders, and the territorial lawyer who'd ridden up from Helena to witness the proceedings. The brass bell above the agency door chimed as Hannah stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating the formal transfer papers spread across Agent Thompson's desk. Her signature would divide the Braddock estate, nearly 4,000 acres of Montana's richest grassland. You understand, Agent Thompson said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Once signed, this cannot be undone. Hannah's hand was steady as she lifted the pen. I understand perfectly. She thought of Cade, still recovering in his cabin, the bullet wound in his shoulder healing slowly. He'd insisted on coming down to witness this, but she'd made him stay in bed. His fever had only broken 3 days ago. The scratch of the pen seemed loud in the quiet office. Hannah signed her full name, Hannah Louise Braddock, to both sets of papers. The first would return the stolen acreage to the Comanche band from which it had been taken. The second would establish the new school and orphanage on the remaining land. Outside, wagon wheels creaked as the first cattle drives began. The remaining Braddock herds were being moved to auction in Bozeman. The money would fund the school for years to come. Elder Running Horse, his face weathered like old leather, stepped forward to accept the transfer papers. He spoke in Comanche first, then in careful English. "This land remembers the feet of our children. Now it will know them again." Hannah bowed her head slightly the way she'd seen Cade do. It was never mine to keep. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of paperwork and handshakes. Pastor Tolliver had already agreed to serve on the school's board of trustees, along with Elder Running Horse and 2 other tribal representatives. They would build something new here, a place where children from both worlds could learn together. By late afternoon, Hannah's wagon wound up the narrow trail to Cade's cabin. The setting sun painted the mountains gold and purple. Smoke curled from the chimney, and she could see Cade's figure on the porch wrapped in a blanket despite the mild weather. She tied the wagon and climbed the steps, noting how he still favored his left side. The bullet had gone clean through, but the fever had nearly taken him. "You did it then?" he asked quietly. Hannah settled beside him on the rough-hewn bench. "It's done. Elder Running Horse accepted the transfer. The school papers are signed too." She pulled out a folded document. "This is for you." Cade took it with his good hand, scanning the careful legal script. His eyes widened slightly. "This makes me a trustee." "The children will need someone who understands both worlds," Hannah said. "Someone who can teach them to track and trap, to read the weather and the land. Someone who knows the old stories." A lone meadowlark called from the timber. Cade folded the paper carefully. "Why?" he asked finally. Hannah looked out over the valley where the first stars were appearing. "I'm not giving this land away," she said softly. "I'm giving it back. Back to the people it belonged to. Back to the children who deserve a future built on truth, not lies." She turned to face him. "Back to the memory of your wife and son, who should have lived to see this day." Cade's eyes glistened in the fading light. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the mountains. Below, in Hollow Rock, lamps were being lit. The town was changing, Hannah knew. Deputy Harlan's flight had broken the syndicate's power. Other men had stepped forward to confess their parts in the land theft, seeking to make amends. It wouldn't be easy, building trust between 2 peoples who'd known so much pain. But it would be right. "Your wife," Hannah said quietly. "What was her name?" "Morning Star," Cade answered, his voice rough with memory. "And our boy was called Little Bear." Hannah squeezed his hand. "Then we'll put their names first in the school records. They'll be remembered." The mountain air grew cooler as night deepened. In the distance, a coyote called, a lonely, hopeful sound that echoed through the timber. Tomorrow would bring more changes, more challenges. But tonight, sitting beside Cade on his cabin porch, Hannah felt the rightness of what she'd done settling into her bones like a prayer. Spring came early to the Bitterroot Mountains that year. The last patches of snow melted away, revealing tender green shoots pushing through dark soil. Hannah stood in what remained of the cabin's old garden, watching Cade turn over the earth with steady strokes of his spade. The wound in his shoulder had healed well, though he still rolled it carefully some mornings. Now his movements were sure and strong as he worked the ground, preparing it for new life. "My grandmother had a garden like this," Hannah said, kneeling to clear away dead leaves. "She grew healing herbs alongside her vegetables, said that's how the good Lord meant it to be." Cade nodded, pausing to wipe his brow. Morning Star did the same. The medicine plants need the food plants near. Everything grows better together. They worked side by side through the morning, enlarging the old plot. The garden would need to feed more than just 2 people now. The first children would arrive within the month. 3 from the agency orphanage, 2 from Hollow Rock whose parents had died of fever over the winter. Above them, the cabin's new roof gleamed with fresh-cut shingles, They'd spent weeks repairing it, Hannah handing up boards while Cade hammered them into place. The inside had been transformed too. Fresh whitewash brightened the walls, and Hannah had sewn new curtains for the windows. 2 small bedrooms had been added, with sturdy bunks built by Cade's careful hands. As the sun climbed higher, Pastor Tolliver's wagon appeared on the trail, winding its way up from town. He carried his Bible and a small flask of holy water for the blessing ceremony. Hannah brushed dirt from her skirts and went to greet him. "The Lord's peace be upon this place," the pastor said warmly, accepting a cup of water from the well. His eyes crinkled as he surveyed their work. "You've made something fine here, both of you." The blessing was simple but profound. They gathered in the cabin's main room, where morning light streamed through clean windows. Pastor Tolliver read from Isaiah about new wine in new wineskins, about old things passing away. He sprinkled water in the doorways and corners, his words weaving together Christian prayer and acknowledgement of the sacred land they stood upon. "Let this be a place of healing," he intoned, "a place where 2 peoples become one family under heaven's eyes." After the ceremony, the pastor departed with promises to return when the children arrived. Hannah and Cade stood in the doorway, watching his wagon disappear down the trail. The spring breeze carried the scent of wild roses and fresh-turned earth. Cade touched Hannah's arm gently. "Walk with me?" He led her to a fallen log near the creek, where wildflowers nodded in patches of sunlight. From his pocket, he drew out something wrapped in soft deerskin. "I'm not a man of many words," he said quietly, "but I need to say this right." His fingers worked the wrapping open, revealing a small wooden cross, beautifully carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines. "My people, both my peoples, may have different ways of asking, but the heart's question is the same." Hannah's breath caught as she recognized symbols from both their worlds intertwined in the carving. Christian crosses flowing into Comanche morning stars, all embraced by living plants that seemed to grow from the very grain of the wood. "You gave back what was stolen," Cade continued, his voice rough with emotion. "You made right what was wrong. You saw me, all of me, when others looked away." He held out the cross. "I'm asking if you'll build this new life with me, not because anyone traded or forced, but because we choose each other, free and true." Tears spilled down Hannah's cheeks as she took the cross, feeling the smooth wood warm against her palm. All the pain of her past, the barren years, the shame, the betrayal, seemed to fall away like winter ice breaking up in spring floods. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes." She kissed him then, tasting the salt of her own tears. His arms came around her, strong and gentle, as the creek sang its endless song beside them. When they finally drew apart, Cade touched his forehead to hers in the Comanche way of sharing breath, sharing life. Above them, a pair of hawks circled in the spring sky, their cries echoing off the mountainsides. New life was coming to this high valley. Children's voices would soon fill the quiet places, and ancient wisdom would meet fresh hope in the garden's fertile soil. But for now, it was enough to sit by the singing water, holding each other close, as the wild roses bloomed around them. The first snow of winter dusted the Bitterroot Mountains like powdered sugar on a cake. Inside the cabin-turned schoolhouse, warmth and activity filled every corner. Little Sarah, just 7 years old, struggled with an armload of split pine while Thomas, nearly 12, steadied her steps. "Easy there," Cade said, taking half the load. "Small loads make for more trips, but safer ones." His voice was gentle, the kind that made children listen without fear. Hannah watched from the doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. The sight of Cade teaching the children still made her heart swell. 5 young ones now called this place home, with 3 more coming for daily lessons from nearby homesteads. The sound of wagon wheels brought everyone's attention to the trail. Through the swirling snow came Elder Joseph, his dark blanket bright with Navajo patterns. The children ran to greet him, knowing he always brought stories with his visits. "The winter spirits dance early this year," the elder said, climbing down carefully. From his wagon, he lifted a beautifully woven pouch. "I bring seeds from our southern gardens." They will sleep through the cold and wake strong in your spring soil. Inside, Hannah served hot tea while Elder Joseph blessed the room with sacred smoke and prayers in 3 languages. The children sat transfixed as he explained how each seed held stories of its own people, its own journey. Later, as evening drew its purple curtain across the mountains, the family gathered around the hearth. Cade's voice, once so rarely heard, filled the room with ancient words. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Sarah, curled against Hannah's side, watched the firelight play across Cade's face. "Miss Hannah," she whispered, fingers twisting in her nightdress, "was Mr. Cade always this kind?" Hannah's hands moved steadily through the girl's long hair, braiding it for sleep. She caught Cade's eye across the room, saw the shadow of old pain fade into the light of now. "No, little one," she said softly. "He learned it the hard way, like me." The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the garden where food and medicine grew side by side. The school bell, silent now, waited for tomorrow's lessons. Here in this place, built from broken pieces and mended hearts, peace had finally found root and flourished. Cade closed the Bible, his wedding band catching the firelight. Together they had become what the land needed. Not owners, but stewards. Not judges, but healers. Teaching the next generation that love, like winter wheat, grows strongest through the hardest seasons. Chapter 14. Treated like no one. The first snowfall came early that year, thick flakes swirling outside the cabin windows like dancers in white dresses. Hannah sat in the old rocking chair by the fireplace, little Sarah sleeping soundly in her lap. The child's breath came soft and steady, her small hands clutching Hannah's shawl. The door creaked open, bringing a swirl of snow and Cade's broad figure. He stamped his boots quietly, mindful of the sleeping child. From his satchel, he pulled out dried herbs wrapped in cloth and a brown paper bag of sugar, precious items from his trip to the trading post. "Storm's picking up," he said softly, hanging his coat by the door. The leather was crusted with fresh snow that began to melt in the cabin's warmth. Hannah watched him move about the kitchen, his movements sure and gentle as he set coffee to brew. The familiar scent soon filled the air, mixing with wood smoke and pine. Outside, she could hear the other children's laughter as they caught snowflakes on their tongues, their joy echoing across the yard. Cade brought her a steaming cup, careful not to disturb Sarah. He settled into his chair beside them, and together they watched the storm through the window. The silence between them was comfortable, like a well-worn quilt. Hannah turned to look at him, this man who had changed everything. The firelight caught the silver in his hair, the quiet strength in his face. "When he gave me away," she said softly, "I thought I was nothing. But you never once made me feel less than whole." Cade's eyes met hers, deep and steady as mountain pools. "You were never broken," he answered simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. Sarah stirred in Hannah's lap but didn't wake. Outside, Thomas called to the others, their boots crunching in the fresh snow as they built what sounded like a fort. The home was warm, filled with the kind of peace Hannah had once thought impossible. She reached for Cade's hand and he took it, his calloused fingers gentle. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.